So now to introduce tonight's speaker as our Vice President of Programs, Rita Bonacero.
Thanks, Howard. Hi, everybody. Most of us probably don't take our personal property for granted. I know I don't. But what we might take for granted is our right to personal property. And to me, this right is something is as American as baseball, 4th of July celebrations, and the Wild Wild West. Today, however, according to American Stewards, a 501c3 organization, nearly half the land in our nation is owned by government, international corporations, and land trusts, and the rest is highly regulated. Our guest speaker this evening is Ms. Elizabeth Nickson. She is a columnist, investigative journalist, and novelist. She was European Bureau Chief of Life magazine in the late 80s and early 90s. And while there, she interviewed Nelson Mandela, Margaret Thatcher, the Dalai Lama, and dozens of other leaders, politicians, and royalty, as well as torture victims, political prisoners, and criminals. She was also a reporter at the London Bureau of Time magazine and has written for numerous publications, including the London Sunday Times Magazine, The Guardian, The Observer, Vogue, and Harper's Magazine. In 1998, Ms. Nickson moved to Salt Spring Island in Canada, where her confrontation with the environmental movement began. When she attempted to subdivide her property, she was confronted with a powerful and insidious opposition. She was in for one heck of a fight, but her investigative talent and her experience served her well as she embarked on a journey to unmask the radical conservation movement. This journey resulted in her latest book, Eco-Fascists, How Radical Conservationists Are Destroying Our Natural Heritage. Ms. Nickson will be selling and signing her book this evening, and I highly recommend it. It is believed that Adolf Hitler's favorite proverb was from an anonymous ancient Roman. It reads, "The people wish to be deceived, so let them be deceived." Elizabeth Nickson has done all of us a huge service by uncovering deceit. So please give a warm welcome to Elizabeth Nickson.
I drove all the way from British Columbia to be here tonight because Mimi Steele and Rita Bonacera did not let me go. It was wonderful. I mean, my husband said, "Honey, why are you doing this again?" Anyway, I am Canadian, but as I discovered in the process of researching my book, I'm from a very old American family, which came to the States in 1630, and we landed in Nantucket and pioneered all across the West and Chicago and through up into the New York State, and eventually we went up into Canada. And I'll talk a bit about them later because they kind of inspired me through the writing of the book, the way the people that I meet in the States inspire me, who to me seem much of a muchness. They were ordinary people who wanted to live a free life. And they came over here, they were not aristocrats, they were not privileged, they were ordinary English men and women who were religious and serious. And in 1657, they hung on their cooking pot and cooked their homely meals and went down to the founding of Windsor, Connecticut, in the Connecticut Valley. So they really, I think that the spirit, their spirit, I think, is found in the Tea Party today, and it's very exciting to me. Anyway, so I was trained as a classical journalist at Time magazine. sort of detached, and I was taught how to write and how to interview, and I was very lucky and got a wonderful job and was really dragged through many of the events of the late 80s and early 90s, and learned a great deal about writing and how to communicate and how to be a proper journalist, and there are not that many of them around anymore. So in 1998, while I was in London, I bought 30 acres on an island off Vancouver Island near my parents' retirement home. And in 1998, my father started to die, and I moved home to take care of my family and get my mother through this transition. And I thought, well, I'll sell that and go back to my real life. But actually, I couldn't sell it. I built a small house, and as it happened, the internet had reached critical mass, and I was able to continue writing as a journalist, which was great. And I was in favor of the environmental movement at the time, and because it was the main story out there, I started writing about it. And whenever I criticized it, I would get this astonishing blowback. I had death threats, I had phone calls in the middle of the night, I had hate mail, there were letters to the local papers week after week after week after week, criticizing me and imputing me with all kinds of... Anyway, so the result of that, for me, was curiosity. And why are they doing this to me? I am absolutely, a total neutral reporter. I'm reporting on what I see. So the more hate I got, the more engaged I became, and I would continue working on it, picking away at the science and the legislation. And then one day, the man with whom I bought the property fell ill. He had a stroke at the age of 38, and he was English. He couldn't come to Canada. I had to sell a bit to make his life livable. So the Gulf Islands, which are like America's San Juans, are run by the Islands Trust. The Islands Trust is a typical Agenda 21 organization, which you now have in One Bay. It is anti-democratic. It doesn't have proportional representation. There are a lot of environmental NGOs on its council, and they run the islands, not us. So when I did this is my property, that whole piece. And I had to eventually divide it in half because it was so expensive to do this that I couldn't afford just to sell 5 acres. I had to sell my house and move down to the lower half of the property. This is the process map that I had to follow. Okay, so 22 months, $160,000, 5 lawyers, 4 engineers, 3 surveyors. I had to covenant that green space, and between those 2 creeks I built a salmon enhancement pond. And then they let me through, and I was the first in 1,000 applications. And it was because I spent my whole time lobbying. I just went from interest group to interest group, and I just begged. I begged, and I said, I'm going to do a greenhouse, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm very green. I lied my head off. But I did build a greenhouse, and it's very beautiful, and it has, it's lovely to live in, and all the things that are green in it are wonderful, but they cost an enormous amount of money. So, when I finished this, I wanted to know, is this happening in other places? The answer was yes, it's happening everywhere. So given that, my first question is, what is happening to the human community? Because if they were anything like me, they were severely degraded and broke. What's happening to the rural resource and exurban community economy? What's happening to the forests and ranges under Green Command? And what's happening with water? And then I got into my car and I drove into America's backcountry. I drove about 12,000 miles over 2 years, mostly for some reason in the winter. And I would just walk into a small town. I'd go into the mayor's office and I'd say, so what's happening here? And she, and it was often a she, would look at me and she said, we are dying. we're dying here. And I'd say, why? And she'd say, the environmental movement. These people moved into our town, they took over our organizations, they started agitating for this and that and this and that. They brought in all their army of consultants, and all of a sudden, the ranches were shut down, the mills were shut down, the forests were shut down. We're a welfare county. And their schools are closing and their hospitals are closing. This was happening in tens of thousands of little towns all across America. You probably all know what clearances are. They're a historical thing. The Scottish Highlands were a notorious clearance. When the elites decide to clear people off the land, it's called a clearance. And the clearance of the American Indians is a clearance, for instance. They're happening here in America, and they're happening in the developing world. Okay, so this is what our moral arbiters have done in the last 20 years in the poorest, the most desperate, the most undereducated, the most marginal people. They have moved them off their ancestral lands into shanty towns and tent camps that circle their once beautiful homelands where they lived a hunter-gatherer existence. 20 million people. That's more than an order of magnitude of all the American Indian clearances wrapped together in a bow and then tripled several times. And that's peer-reviewed, seriously peer-reviewed. In the States, it's 40 million people. So when I got a publisher, I'm published by HarperCollins in New York, and my editor was Adam Bellow, who's Saul Bellow's son, and I was so relieved to get him because he is powerful enough in HarperCollins to give me the best fact checkers, lawyers, copy editors, and this book was gone over with a fine-tooth comb about 7 different times. We hired an independent fact checker. When it was published and it went to Washington, D.C., the National Center for Public Policy Analysis took my statistical analysis of clearances and sent it to the National Agricultural Statistical Service of the USDA for fact-checking. And they came back to say I had done a very good job, but I had undercounted the number of people that have been cleared from America's rural lands by the environmental people. Not by much, but enough. So 40 million. That's what it looks like in a graph. That's what it looks like now out there. The Grange used to be the heart of rural communities. We use the social accounting matrices. I explain this to my left-wing friends as think of a private college in a small town. 200 professors and adjunct, and then you've got the people around who support the professors, and then you've got the people that keep the university together, and then you have the people that work in the town. You have everybody's families. When you extract 200 jobs from a ranching community or a forestry community, you actually eviscerate that community because there is no reason for that community to exist any longer. So there are direct and indirect clearances. In these small towns, the public services go away because the town can't afford to keep the hospital going. This is deliberate, by the way. So the livestock industry was the industry most hardest hit. That's about 25 million people. Despite the fact that more people are eating beef and so on because there are more people in the US, but more people can afford it. And so despite the propaganda from the movement, more people are eating meat because it's good solid protein. That's the loss of all the various operations. That's how many operations have gone down, despite the population going up by 1/3 since 1980. This is what it looks like out there. It's just one deserted building after another. Everything's boarded up. Del Norte County in Northern California is a really good case study because the county supervisors over a period of 10 years have commissioned study after study to see what has happened to their community since Redwood National Forest was made a national park and added to and then added to again and then added to again. And Del Norte was a logging community and the most productive harbor in Northern California as far as fishing, the fishing fleet went. Today it's devastated because of the movement. Okay, well that's forestry because 10 million people have been cleared. But it has to do with Del Norte because it was this forested community. It was one of those working class towns where everybody went to school, everybody had holidays, everybody could pay for the dentist. If you were a smart kid, you got to go to college because the jobs were family wage jobs. Those jobs have been gone. I talked to the county supervisor. They said men come to us with tears in their eyes. They cannot feed their families. So the big thing that these people promote is that tourism is going to replace all these lost jobs, and it never does. It never does. So when they created Redwood National Forest, they brought these studies to Congress and said this is going to happen, and look how many visitors we're going to have. 4.5% of the tourists that they projected turned up. It's just one lie after another. When you clear a town by creating parkland or conservation areas, you get rid of property taxes. So what they do is they promise something called PILT, which is payment in lieu of taxes. And they do occasionally pay that, but not for very long, and then they just decide, oh, we've paid enough, that's it, move on. Tourism. So what happened in Del Norte, because it is so beautiful, is that the environmental bureaucracy moved into Del Norte County because they really like that, and they get to regulate and regulate and regulate and regulate. So as a result, and they all get paid very well. They make six-figure incomes, low six-figure, but six figures. So now in Del Norte, 33% is in, this is a county of 27,000 people. 33% of them work for green bureaucracy. These are the agencies that are located in Del Norte and do nothing but regulate. State agencies, federal agencies. So every day, the county supervisors wake up, go into their office and say, who's going to land something on my table that means that somebody else's life is going to be ruined? That's what they do. This is a chart done by the Mercatus Institute at George Mason University based on my statistical analysis, and it shows as we lost ranching operations, it was twinned by a rise in environmental regulation. So they're parallel tracks. Okay, so Rita mentioned American Stewards' fact about how much land has been saved. This really shocked me. So by 2005, it was about 500 million acres have been set aside in 2005. In 2010, it was 700 million acres. 800 million acres. There's 2.2 billion acres in the US. Today, right now, and you're part of it with your priority conservation areas, the Bureau of Land Management has identified 213 million acres that they want to take either from private property or take out of leaseholds because ranchers use rangeland and lease it. So that will bring it up to half of America is under strict conservation, and that means that process map that I showed you, if anything happens, it goes through that kind of a system, and your chance of success is perhaps 1 in 1,000. So the actual fact is that urban areas in the States take up 2.6% of the land mass, and rural development brings that to 5.6%. The rest is rural and virtually empty. About half of America is open space. The one thing that has gone up in the country is land trusts. Lots and lots of land trusts. And conservation easements. Those have just shot up as well. This is private land trusts own 50 million acres. This is the Turnip Foundation in Bozeman, Montana. They are a real locus of this stuff. I mean, he hires, I don't know, the most irresponsible biologists on the planet, and they go around taking people's land and giving them little bits of money, and they go to a rancher in distress and say, oh, well, we'll just set aside this part of your property and we'll do an easement. Turner is fierce in this area. This is his building. I thought I put in the Grange again so you could see what, you know, the transition of power from the Grange, which was a... Okay, so we think that one of the reasons that commodity prices have gone up so much is that all over the world land has been set aside similar to that in the States. In Canada, we set aside 70% of our land. In the developing world, we set aside as much as the continent of Africa. So if you do set aside that much land, the natural result is that the price of everything that comes from the land goes up 600% from 2000 to 2010, and that's when the real metastatic conservation happened, was from 1990 to 2010. Okay, so these are out of, since 2010. Sorry about. In 3 years, if you add these up together and divide them by 3, these commodities have all gone up 11.8% a year. This is when we're supposed to have inflation of between 1 and 2%. But these are the commodities that affect the least advantage: the elderly, young families starting out, the producers in our culture and working and middle class people who are starting businesses who use things. This really affects us. So it's all based on the biodiversity thing, which is the biggest lie I found. And I didn't, you know, come to that conclusion myself. I talked to some very, very smart people who had gone into the science and worked through it. There's a man, E.O. Wilson, he's at Stanford, and he is sort of the colossus astride endangered species and biodiversity. And his work, Island Biogeography, is the go-to text for every decision made about land use all over the world. So that's his equation. This is what he believes. The number of species, can I take this out? The number of species doomed to extinction every year is 27,000. Every day it's 74, and every hour it's 3. 1992. This is the US Geological Survey map that they trot into all these meetings in the higher regions of the bureaucracy, showing that as population goes up, so do extinctions. This is really shocking. Okay, so we've had, from 1500 to 1990, our extinction rate was 1.6 bird and mammal critters a year. 1.6. Not 6 every hour, not 27 every day, not 27,000 a year. 6. I'll show you. 4 mammals and 6 bird species in the last 500 years. That's the reality. So when the lawyer at HarperCollins got a hold of this part of my book, he lost it. He said, there's no way, this is not true. You have to source this and resource it and resource it and resource it again. And I did. And eventually he just said, okay, I give up. You're right. That was a very good day. there is this thing called island extinctions, which makes sense. You know, Easter Island is the thing that's always advanced by Jared Diamond and Collapse. Easter Island, they ate everything on the island. Well, islands, yes, that makes sense. But the thing is that nature travels, and that island extinctions are greater by a factor of 6. Also, Fish and Wildlife use distinct population species, so the salmon that run in one stream are very slightly genetically different from the salmon that run in a stream that's 5 miles away. And so they call those different species, but they are not. It doesn't really hold water in science. The reason that we're having fewer extinctions is because of the environmental Kuznets curve. I love this thing. Kuznets won the Nobel for this curve in 1972, and the environmental curve was invented in 92. It shows that, oh, I have this red thing here, don't I? Right here, when we're living in grass huts, the environment is in really good shape. As a culture industrializes, environmental decay happens. Poisons get flushed into rivers, the whole ball of wax that you can remember from the Industrial Revolution in high school history class. There's a turning point, and it's not at a very high annual per income. It's about 3,000. At 5,000 a year, people start to demand clean water, and the richer the culture gets, the cleaner the environment, until we're back down at grass hut. When you limit people's income through bad environmental policy, you create environmental decay. This is because they are working from an idea that is not, it's a bad idea. It's the ecosystem idea. There is no such thing as an ecosystem. It's only been found in labs. It's only been found in glass bubbles. It's never been found in real life. There is no such thing as a perfect ecosystem in balance. It does not exist. Nature is chaotic, it's ever-changing, it owes more to chaos theory, edges bleed into each other, and there is always shift. If you try to create a perfect ecosystem in balance with all of the critters and insects and birds in the right proportion, you have created disaster. But that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create perfectly balanced ecosystems, and they believe in this like they believed in nothing since, I don't know, since the Catholic Church in 1100 AD. So the wonderful thing about the Pacific Northwest forest is that it grows 4 times faster than any other temperate forest in the world. And so, as a result, when Clinton shut down that forest in '93 because of the spotted owl, the Forest Service, which has, because it's a public institution, you can get into the records, they have been doing audits of these forests all the way along. There's still old school biologists in the Forest Service, and they have been keeping records. And the picture is not pretty. The environmental movement decided that the Pacific Northwest forest had to be placed under ecosystem management. And so they litigate against any old school silviculture like thinning or clearing or replanting because it's not natural. The results are as follows. So this fire that the Forest Service fears most is a canopy fire, and it will burn so hot that the dirt will be scarified and none of the seeds in the dirt will live. All of the fish will be gone from the creeks, and all of the wildlife will be gone from the forest, and it will take decades to regenerate. If ever, that fire will burn so hot, because where there was once 60 to 80 healthy trees, because of the movement, there are now 500 trees in an acre. And so they're tiny, they're gray, they're malnourished, their immune systems are susceptible to pests. And so that forest, there's 6 million acres, it's called the Valley of Death, because it's just rotted out. So there's less water for downstream communities. The pine beetle in British Columbia is a catastrophe. I mean, it's like driving through Armageddon, and it could have been stopped. There was a compound, an arsenic-based compound, that the Sierra Club litigated against even testing. You can't even, there's no way to stop it now, but it could have been stopped, but the environmental movement refused to allow testing. Yeah, so in northern Montana, they've got grizzlies in the human communities because they can't get up into the forests anymore. So both the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management used to make money, and they would pay for rural schools and rural services. Now, they now all lose money. This fascinated me, that in Yellowstone, sewage was bleeding into a native trout stream, and it's so complex now. They call it analysis paralysis. They cannot make decisions because the science they're depending on is so ill-founded that you can't make anything work. So in order to stop that sewage running into the creek, they needed an act of Congress. Oh, I love this part. This is my country. That's what they have just recently taken, the green part. Isn't that something? So 50% of that has been set aside, and the rest is under ecosystem management. This is our north and central coast. When they shut down forestry and mining, it meant that the natives on the central and north coast didn't have employment. So what the environmental NGOs did was they created the Coast Opportunity Fund, which now trains natives to be environmental activists. Yeah. So I'm just here trying to show you how complex their mapping has become. So they'll do forestry, they'll do land and sea together, they'll do, this is sort of the areas that they've decided to set aside, and the names that they've given. They all give these sort of sickeningly sentimental names. And so this is the salmon thing that Siskiyou County is wrestling with. This is Yellowstone to Yukon, and that is a First Nations, as we call them up there, environmental NGO, 5.2 million acre land taking, starting in Yellowstone, going all the way up to the Yukon. This is the Baja to Bering initiative. That is meant not only to stop fishing, but to stop tanker traffic and shipping. They don't really like shipping, nasty. This is this kind of freaked me out when someone first sent it to me. It's our border, and it's the watershed of the continent, and they want ecosystem management on that. They're getting there. They do it piecemeal. This is Algonquin to Adirondacks. That's virtually in place. This is northern Quebec. It's twice the size of France that they've set aside. It's filled with, Quebec, French Canada is so bankrupt, it's beyond bankrupt. But they've set aside twice the area of France, worth, trillions of dollars of natural resources locked up in there. This is their kind of sentimental map. So that's their plan, wherever the wild ways are, there will be no humans. This, you've all seen this, right? Well, wherever I went in the States, people said it's already in place. They just did it piecemeal. So the money is kind of intense as well. They have about $400 billion a year that they spend promoting their agenda. So that's why everybody believes what they say. A friend of mine who's a market researcher compared it this way. When Microsoft rolled out Windows 8, it cost them $400 million. The environmental movement spends that every single week promoting their version of reality, every single week. So this is basically the hierarchy of the way they spend money. The UN and International Union for the Conservation of Nature, really they design the programs along with environmental NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund. And there's 26,500 environmental NGOs operating in the States. So together they spend, that's number 4, they spend almost $10 billion a year. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature creates the science. They've been spending $100 million a year since 1992. And then there's the various, so anyway, this concerned me quite a lot. As you probably know, all our development aid, it goes through the UN and through the Agenda 21 program, and it's then parceled out to developing nations. So the dark purple, or the purple and the blue, are bilateral and multilateral development money. It's all given through the sustainability prism, which obviously means that all the land is set aside and nobody can use any resources. So that's why the developing world has not developed. The red streak is the money that we give when there's a giant flood or a tsunami or an earthquake. So the proportionality is shocking. And the brown is debt forgiveness. So Pacific Legal Foundation, I'm kind of a fan. I think they're fantastic. I wish we had them in Canada. Also, CAPER is doing really great work. It's a humble organization, but it has many successes under its belt. Liberty Seen is a new thing that I think was started by Americans for Prosperity, the California chapter, and it's trying to bring all of the reporting on what's going on together. It's a new organization. I understand that Americans for Prosperity is starting a national property rights organization, and they're going to start just bringing everybody together and educating them and creating pods of activists in every state and every county. I hope they do it. The High Sheriff, well, you know, you're having him come to speak. He was fantastic. American Stewards in Texas, Margaret Byfield is Wayne Hage's daughter. She's about 35 now, and her husband is a water lawyer, and they do not lose any of their fights ever. And Margaret said she's very meticulous, very humble, very methodical. She says that every time they go into a negotiation, their science is wrong and their process is wrong. They always make mistakes. And one of the great things that Margaret came up with, along with Fred Kelly Grant, who's a lawyer in Idaho, is called coordination. It was invented or brought into being at the First Continental Congress when the participants decided that the basic unit of government was county government. And since all the laws made at the top come home to roost in counties, the counties had to be equal participants at any table, and they could not be overridden. You had to reach consistency with them. And that has been placed in all of the environmental legislation like NEPA and all the many other ones, FLPMA. Coordination, whenever it's been used, they win too. It's I think there are about 150 victories, but Fred Kelly Grant has just received a large sum of money to launch coordination efforts in a couple of dozen counties across America. So they're stepping it up. They've got a big team. So we're hoping for great things from that as well. We have a toolbox up here that we like to use. And we just like to get in these people's faces and saying, because they all run charities, right? Well, how is this a charity? Because it's bankrupting us, right? Is that a charity? I don't think so. How is this representative? Who's paying the bills? That's a good one to ask. In the Gulf Islands, we've got about 100 activists. We know that they're paid to show up at every meeting and prosecute this constant no-use stuff. And how is this your business? That's a good one to ask too. I mean, why are you in my private property rights? Why do you get to say that? So yeah, I told you about Fred Kelly Grant. That's Southeast Colorado. Kimmy Lewis, who's a great gal. She's a rancher and she's a great fighter. They tried to take 2.3 million acres for the Army. They already have, I don't know, several 100,000 acres, but they wanted more, and it was in coordination with the Nature Conservancy. So far, she's managed to stop it. That's the project that I'm working on right now, and this is my think tank, the Frontier Center. Yep, that's it. Okay, that's it. I hope it's scaring you.
Time for the Q&A, and those of you who are familiar know that we have ushers who will be passing out a little card, and then put your question on the card. They'll be collecting it. The gentleman over here will be reading the question, and Guido and Bruno are in the back in case there's people distracting. So now we'll have the Q&A now, and we'll start with. See if we get his microphone. Thank you.
We're not going to have side conversations tonight, right? The environmental movement seems to be one of the owners of the Democratic Party. With that as the basis, how can they be stopped?
One of the reasons that I brought up my, historical family at the beginning of this is because I don't think, when my father retired at the age of 55 to Vancouver, he was from a family, both his grandfathers had pioneered out there. And he immediately began his charity work under the wing of his uncle. And that family, and I am a failed member as far as this goes, they never let their civic organizations languish. They were always, they knew that it was their city and their neighborhood, and if they didn't show up, then things wouldn't happen, or bad things would happen. It was hardwired in that generation, my father's generation. And we've lost those skills, and we've assigned our futures to planners and bureaucrats. And in many ways, and Fred Kelly Grant, he said this first, that his generation, he's 78, he said our generation just turned our backs and walked away. And we deserve what we got. And so we have to relearn those skills and just get back in their faces and take our power back. I don't think there's any other answer, frankly.
Is this being taught in K through 12 schools? How can we stop it there?
Yeah, I don't know. I wrote a column last week complaining. Our local high school, we had Bill McGibbon come in, and he's agitating against the Alberta oil sands. And at the end of his talk, a young woman with cerebral palsy got up and said, you know, I'm going to die young anyway, but you make me feel as if I should kill myself now for the sake of the planet. I don't think we should be letting these people in our schools.
Who is funding the conservation agenda?
Who's funding it? Well, probably a lot of people in San Francisco. The very, very wealthy are funding it. I have a girlfriend who's a member of one of Canada's wealthiest families, and they are conservative, but they are forced to give money to the Nature Conservancy of Canada, because if they don't, they are not perceived as green. It's almost a form of extortion at this point. You know, so every foundation funds environmental efforts, and there has been very little critical thinking attached to these funding efforts.
Any more examples of bogus science?
Well, there's tons of it, and one of the most interesting is Alan Savory, who is a rangeland specialist. He has an institute called the Savory Institute, and he describes how, and this is something that I observed when I drove down. I didn't know what I was seeing, but it looked like these empty fields were turning to desert, and he says that clearing cattle off the ranges is desertifying the ranges, because cloven hooves would break up the soil and bring oxygen and nitrogen into it and create these wonderful grasslands. Millions of cattle have been removed, and the grasslands as a result are dying.
What are your thoughts on climate change? Is the science supporting the climate change argument legitimate?
No, I don't think it is.
Where does the $400 billion come from? Government, our government taxes?
Oh, well, the UN has $260 million. Our governments give money to the UN, as do they give money to the IUCN. The European Union, it's tax money. The foundation money is generally wealthy people. A lot of it is our money, about 90%.
Would eliminating the EPA do much to stop this environmental movement?
Yes, it would. It would be a mighty blow. I recommend it.
Who are the key people at the head of this agenda? Obama, probably.
Well, I think he's probably just their pawn, really. I don't know who's running it now, and don't generally get involved in personalities that they always change, but I do know that, for instance, the head of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is an enormously wealthy and powerful outfit, much like the Nature Conservancy, and the man who runs that is just an enormously ambitious, enormously talented, very bright empire builder. He's building an empire. He's making himself part of history, and that's what these people believe, and we've allowed them to believe it.
You mentioned religion briefly. Environmentalists act as if it is their religion. What are your comments on that?
Yes, I was having a conversation earlier with somebody, and we decided the same thing, that one of my interview subjects, Dr. Alston Chase, is a philosopher of science at Harvard, Oxford, Princeton. He said that man needs mystery, and when we jettisoned Christianity, people decided that nature was the mystery that we had to worship and protect. I think that's a fair comment.
What percentage of environmental activists, A, are serious about this in this movement, B, use the movement as a way to make us a collective country, and C, want to economically destroy the United States?
I think all of the above. How do you?
Third.
Yeah, I do know that the environmentalists that I knew before they decided that they wouldn't speak to me anymore. I had one of them, she was from Los Angeles, an environmental bureaucrat in LA, and I asked her a question once, and she turned to me and she said, "I don't speak to you." I think they're socialists, and they think that socialism is the way to go, and they're willing to use anything that they can to get there. And they believe it wholeheartedly, and most of the cultural left does as well.
What is the environmentalist endgame or ultimate goal? And if they succeed, won't that mean a lower standard of living for whoever's left?
Absolutely. I think they need to drop our standard of living by 50% in order to reduce carbon. I think that's deliberate, and they figure it'll take a generation or two, but that's what they want. Yeah. And if they're already doing it. PERC, the property rights think tank in Montana, has recently released a paper saying that they think that over a generation, which is about 20 to 25 years, the way we're spending on the environment will reduce our GNP by a third.
How much blame, if any, for clearance of farming and ranching can be put on corporate farms and ranches replacing family farms?
Well, I do think that the corporations are very much involved in this, and they see it as a good thing for them, and they exploit it. They do that with forestry as well. If they sign on to the green program, they can pretty much guarantee that small competitors are driven out of business. And they say that. They're quite open about it. You can tell I haven't done anything else for 7 years.
The fire in Yosemite,
Yes.
isn't it due to the environmental lot policy not fitting out the forest?
Yes, I think that, I'm sure that that's it. And also the fire guy that was up here talking about the brush being, fire ladders grow up the trees, and if they're not cut back, if they're not cleared, then it does become like a tinderbox.
Is not part of all this a reduction in population?
Yes. Yes.
We all want to be for the environment. How do we get people to think critically about this subject?
I don't know. It seems as if a great many people's minds are closed, and all you can do is try. We've created a research project which we think is a multi-year project, and we're going to fact check and challenge and do that over and over and over again until we make some inroads, and we're going to create a media campaign because that's what they've done. They have had these extraordinary campaigns that have convinced so many people. Lots of people don't have the time to go into this and figure it out. They get their messages from billboards and glossy magazine stories and advertisements and so on, and so we're just going to have to, we need a lot of money. We need a lot of money to fight this.
Organization is hard. Are there any substantial organizations who promote private property rights and ownership?
Yeah.
You mentioned some.
Yes, there's PERC, P-E-R-C in Montana. They're part of the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and CAPER, and American Stewards in Texas, and Fred Kelly. There are, I would say, 1,000 across the country. we haven't reached critical mass yet.
Is all the environmental movement an excuse to weaken national security while China and others ignore the environment so that UN will end up ruling the US?
I do know that the ranchers in Colorado that I spoke to think that their land is being taken as collateral for the American debt. And that's where that's what they think has happened behind the scenes, that a lot of these conservation easements and a lot of these set-asides are being held as collateral for China. That, to me, made sense. I'm not trained enough to speak to geopolitics with any authority.
You mentioned some good organizations. Could you rate these others? The Heartland Trust, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and Cato Institute.
I'm a fan of all three.
Pardon?
I'm a fan of all three.
I got some more. Hoover Institution.
Great.
Good. That's it. One moment, we got one coming.
Okay.
Bingo. Would the 1,000 organizations to which you just referred be more effective if they were merged, if they would merge their efforts?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But everybody seems to be struck. I mean, the thing about this rural attack is that these communities are far-flung. It takes a lot of effort to travel. Rural people tend to be educated differently than urban people, so it's hard for them to fight this stuff. They don't really get it. And certainly, I have an urban education, and it took me years to figure it out. I am hoping that the California chapter of Americans for Prosperity is going to step up and pull this all together. David Spady told me that that's what they were going to do. So I don't know. I hope so. I know he's very busy.
That's it.
Okay.
Question.